We scoured the world looking for the 5 greatest South African minds and 2 greatest South African heads of hair, and this is what we found. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Makin Sense, South Africa's best news podcast and the Common Sense's flagship podcast. As always, I am joined by a panel of South Africans scattered around the world. Joining us from Germany, where he runs the Bremen Democracy Research Group, the editor of Politics Web, the historian of Heidelberg, James Myburgh. Broadcasting from the last vestiges of the British Empire, the director of wealth of Audley Capital, the crank of bank, Simon Lincoln Reader. Hopping across the Atlantic, we are joined by the director of the Yorktown Foundation for Freedom, the dictator of DC, Richard Tren. And finally, joining us from the Common Sense HQ in Melrose Arch, the renegade of Randburg, Dr. Franz Crinier. So we have a jam-packed show today, gentlemen, but we're going to start at home with the story that seems to have captured South Africa's imagination, and that is the Mkhwanazi case and the subsequent Madlanga Commission of inquiry looking into it. So James, can you give us some context, some background, and some information about Mkhwanazi and the Madlanga Commission?
Basically, last year in April, there was a hit on a man called Armand Swart, just as he was arriving outside the company, the engineering company where he worked, and he was shot, I think, 23 times. And the culprits sped off in a white car, and miraculously for South Africa, they were followed. They were tracked back to their lair in Bramley in Johannesburg, and they were basically caught red-handed. And a huge number of weapons were seized. I think there was another car that was tracked down somewhere else, and the 3 culprits were arrested. One of whom was a serving police officer called Michael Pule. And then from there, it was properly investigated, but there were threats made against the investigating officers and the prosecutors. So the lead prosecutor, I think, appealed for protection, and that was granted. And then the investigators were increasingly found that the investigation was being obstructed, also within the police. And the lead accused was then granted bail in very suspicious circumstances. And so what the police then did was they brought in an investigative team from outside of Gauteng, which was from KwaZulu-Natal, and it was the Political Killings Task Team, or members of the Political Killings Task Team. And according to the account which is being related in the current commission, these guys had been very successful. They were brought in, and they started joining the dots, and that led them to one connected businessman, I think, called Katiso Malefe. But the cat was really put among the pigeons when they searched the house of a very well-connected entrepreneur in Johannesburg called Kat Matlala. And after they searched his house and seized his devices, the allegation is that there then was a huge political pressure brought to bear on the minister, Senzo Mchunu, to basically close, not just sort of curtail the investigation, but completely close down the Political Killings Task Team. And that was done at the end of the month. The National Commission only received those orders in early January. And then all the dockets that the task team had been dealing with were then taken in by a senior police officer in Gauteng called Shadrack Sibia, and and then that is the background. And then Kat Matlala was later charged with firstly he had a huge tender contract with the police that was then cancelled in, I think, about April this year. And then in July, Mkhwanazi, who's the provincial commissioner of police in KwaZulu-Natal, then sort of launched this sort of massive sort of bombshell press conference where he related how the political interference had led to the closure of this task team. And he had in many cases, because they had seized Kat Matlala's cell phone, they had a great deal of information, forensic information, to back up the allegations that it was through this political interference that this task team had been completely closed down, and these dockets had been taken by Sabia, and he was sitting on them, and these investigations had all stalled. So then, obviously, after that conference, that press conference, this commission was then appointed, and that is where we are now. Those allegations are now being investigated, and Mkwanazi has testified, and the National Commission of Police, Fani Masemola, has also recently testified. So that is where we are now.
Okay, and James, the kind of various commissions of inquiry into a number of scandals that South Africa have had kind of varying degrees of reliability. So what are you making of the Madlanga Commission and its efforts into do you think that this is a legitimate attempt to put together the true story of what happened? And
I think it's too early to tell, but Mkwanazi and Masemola have laid out the evidence. I think there's a lot of evidence is going to be presented in camera. But as it seems, they have Kat Matlala's cell phone devices and have extracted the information from that. I don't think all of it's going to be in the public domain, but there's going to be a very strong forensic trail that they will be able to follow. I think quite exceptionally. I think as a bit of background, the way these things have historically worked is that there has been a problem with criminality and politics going back decades in South Africa, and the way these have tended to work is that if someone feels under pressure from a particular investigative body, whether it was those police special units which were active in the second half of the 90s, later the Scorpions, after the Scorpions, the Hawks, SARS was also affected by this. What those being targeted for legitimate investigation will tend to do is to try and dig up the derogatory evidence against those investigating them, or those standing in the way of their corrupt activities. And then if they can get this derogatory information, they then leak that, or criminal charges are then laid against the prosecutors. And so you often get this very confusing situation as an outsider where these allegations are flowing, are being tossed back and forth. And the newspapers in South Africa got very badly burnt by this. I don't so much think in the case of the Scorpions, but certainly in the case of what was called the SARS Rogue Unit by the Sunday Times, and then also the Hawks with Johan Boysen. And these newspapers were being leaked this damaging information, not because these were whistleblowers concerned about wrongdoing in these institutions. It was very dirty elements within the state who felt they were being under threat from these institutions, so they leaked sort of these dossiers to try and discredit these investigative institutions, and then these that gave their political principals the excuse to close these down. So that's I think the tricky problem in any of these cases is there's going to be a lot of dirt being thrown back and forth, and that's what Mkhwanazi alleges in this case, is that there were investigations being pushed against members of crime intelligence that weren't bona fide, that had one of these ulterior motives. But it's very hard to, as an outsider, to actually make that assessment, and one has to be very, very, very careful about, you know, who to believe, but also that, you know, everyone has probably some sort of skeletons in their closet, and it doesn't necessarily mean if someone's, you know, you don't, if someone's guilty of what in South Africa is a minor offense, but they're getting very aggressively investigated for that. You have to ask, well, what is the actual motive? Are they actually worried that this person committed this minor wrongdoing, or is it a way of you know, curtailing their investigation into major wrongdoing? So that's, I think, is the situation where we are now.
And you know, I think it's an interesting. Mkwanazi himself is kind of an interesting character in this, because he seems to, from my understanding, have come from outside of politics, come up through the kind of police ranks, and he finds himself in this position. And so, do you think there could be political motivation behind, you know, him coming out, making the allegations, or do you think this is a case of a good police officer doing good police work and feeling as if there was nowhere else to turn except to take it to the public, so that enough pressure could be put onto the politicians that the case might see the light of day?
It seems that on the actual central case that we're dealing with, it's absolutely bona fide. That, I mean, this guy was murdered. They did make these arrests. They got this evidence off the phone. This Kat Matlala is involved in all sorts of major tenders in Gauteng. He's also very close to all sorts of very, very influential people in Gauteng. So that is, I think, absolutely. And then the political killings task team was shut down. The timeline fits. There's a lot of evidence. Now, where it's going to get muddy is, did the political killings task team do things in other places that maybe weren't so great? And I think that's a sort of separate issue. But I think one must be careful not to get played by this. But on this specific case, the evidence seems very strong. But obviously, it's the early days of the commission, and we'll have to see where it goes, how it plays out, and what other actors, people who have been implicated, have to say for themselves. So one can't say for sure now, but that would be my reading of it at the moment.
Then, James, just sorry, maybe Gabriel's going back there. Gabriel made the point that this chap, Mkhwanazi, came up through the ranks of the police to become the commissioner in KwaZulu-Natal. Now, that's a different trajectory to many other senior police officers. And can you just go to that point?
Sure. Well, I think he actually joined the police in 1993. So he wasn't an ANC cadre. He wasn't coming in from the liberation movement and being deployed into policing. He then joined the police task team, which is a very, very elite unit. He sort of came to prominence because Jacob Zuma appointed him as national commissioner, acting national commissioner at one stage. But interestingly, in his evidence to this commission, he says that he was then sidelined from that position after he questioned why Richard Mdluli, who was a sort of Zuma person who had been implicated in all sorts of criminality, why Mdluli, the charges against Mdluli were being dropped by the National Prosecuting Authority of the time. And he says that that then led to his marginalization within the police for a period until he came back as police commissioner. So I mean I don't have much sort of knowledge of his reputation, but he does seem to have quite a solid reputation in KwaZulu-Natal by people in the know. But I can't speak to that directly.
Yeah, and then just to follow through on the second point that France was raising, could you explain that they like how does the ANC kind of tend to deploy cadres in important roles in the police?
Well, there was a serious effort by the ANC to bring all state institutions under, the direction of the ANC, and that it began with, I suppose, the integration process in 94, but in 97, 98, there was a publicly announced policy of cadre deployment of appointing senior ANC people to head all state institutions, including the police. The person appointed at that time was Jackie Celebi, who had criminal links at the time he was appointed, and he had also been caught in the early 90s stealing donor money, and the ANC nonetheless made him head of the police service. So there's the institution has sort of, and then Celebi then went and closed down all these specialist units, the murder and robbery units, the corruption unit, the anti-drug unit. He shuttered them all. He allocated the detectives to ordinary police stations, or he consolidated them into what then became the Hawks. But the Hawks themselves were appointed by was a centralized body which was very easy to control from the top. So that's the source of a lot of our problems and criminality. So Mkhwanazi, as someone who's not an ANC guy, it is, and Masemola, I think, is also he joined the police service in the 80s. So these aren't guys who were sort of significant figures in the liberation movement. It doesn't mean that of course that people can't have sort of entered into these ANC networks as they made their way up, which I think would have been the case with Richard and Bluli. But both Masemola and Mkwanazi are professional policemen. They didn't join via the liberation movement.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And then I think a point I want to kind of finish your section off on is, what do you think will come out of this commission of inquiry, or is it just too soon to tell? And maybe as a follow-up to that, could the intention here be to kind of create a kind of moment of political theater, so that people feel as if the issue has been resolved, and that allows the ANC more space to kind of have the legal proceedings and whatever, kind of go and maybe happen easier, or that puts less pressure on them?
The danger with these commissions is they end up just sweeping things under the carpet. So that's the worst case scenario, I suppose. And they drag on forever, and by the time they issue their reports, everyone's forgot. If the lawyers have all made huge amounts of money, but people have sort of forgotten what the whole thing was about in the first place. At their worst, and this goes back, obviously, to the previous era as well, they can be used to cover things up or falsely accuse people. At their best, they can be a catalyst for major reform and change. And I think what we are seeing here, in essence, is there is a huge, and there has been for many, many years, a huge problem whereby these political and criminal networks are combined in South Africa. And when you try and investigate the politically connected criminals, you get taken out. You whether it's the Scorpions or the SARS or or now the political Tillings task team, you then get shut down because you've gone after the wrong people. And if this can be the moment where where these political and criminal networks no longer have this dominant say over over our criminal justice system, that'll be a very important moment. But we'll see which path this commission takes.
I think it's one of the major forks in the current major forks in South Africa's road. And staying in South Africa and moving to another major fork in South Africa's road, we had over the weekend Helen Zille formally announcing that she is running for mayor and accepting the DA's candidacy. And Franz, can you tell us what this could mean for Johannesburg, what this could mean for the country, and a little bit also just about what you think about Helen running for mayor?
Yeah, no, I'm going to try and do that. So yeah, a few days ago, it's confirmed that Zille will be the candidate for mayor for the DA in Johannesburg when South Africa goes to its next local government elections. And that will be probably somewhere between November of 2026 and early 2027. Now, that news has obviously created a lot of hype, and a lot of people talk about it, and the question sort of becomes, well, what could you do? Could you win? Is there a chance? And if so, then what? So the answers to that kind of question, those questions have been a bit vague. So I'm going to try and make it much more precise, which is going to be a bit complicated, but let me see if I can get it right. We're going to do it with some numbers. First thing we're going to do is we're going to go back 10 years ago. In 2016, South Africa has local government elections. And those were a big sort of breakthrough set of elections for the Democratic Alliance. And in Johannesburg, that was particularly the case. And in that year, so I've got notes here that I must look at very closely. In that year, 2016, in Johannesburg, the DA got 39% of the votes in the city, and the ANC got 45% of the votes in the city. And the DA, and these numbers are going to become important, got 483,000 votes. And the ANC got 560,000. So it's a decade ago. The DA is at 39, the ANC is at 45. A few years after that, it's 2019 now, and South Africa has national elections. Now, these are a totally different kind of phenomena, and voter behavior is very different, so you can't strictly compare them, but I want to show something that happened. If you take that local government election, 2019, and you just take Johannesburg out of it, the DA now got 30% in the city, so that's down from 39 in the local election 3 years before. 450,000 votes, almost the same number that it got 3 years before. And the ANC got exactly 50% with 760,000 votes. So 200,000 votes more than the 560,000 the ANC had got 3 years before at the local election. And that all makes complete sense because ANC voters take national elections much more seriously than they do local elections. And also in parallel with that, the direct experience of governance on the ground is much more acutely felt at a local government election. So the ANC's always done worse in a local election than a national election. The next election's in 2021 in Johannesburg, and it's a local election again, and this time the DA gets 25%. So the previous two, it's been, at 39 in the previous local election, then 30 in the next national. Now it's at 25, 230,000 votes. And it sounds terrible, but there's more going on this time because a new party, ASA, of Herman Mashaba, has taken a big chunk of the vote, 18%, and 170,000 votes. And it takes a lot of that from the DA. If you add the DA-ASA votes together, the two of them got 43% in the local government elections of 2021. The ANC got 33%, or 360,000 votes. Just a quick recap. We'll just do the local numbers. 2016, the DA gets 39% and 483,000 votes. 2021, the DA group with ASA in it gets 400,000 votes and 43%. But the ANC vote, see why this is complicated, in 2021, they get only 306,000 votes compared to the 560,000 votes they'd had at the previous local government election. We then go to 2024, and when I say what this all means, it will make a bit more, it will trigger in your mind, I think, some of these numbers. 2024, it's now a national government election. In Johannesburg, the DA is at 25% with 350,000 votes. ASA is at 6%. It's starting to fall apart with 88,000. The ANC is 32% with 450,000 votes. Where we've looked at these numbers in some detail, and I've been greatly helped in this by a chap called Richard Wilkinson, who's done a lot of the maths. In order for Helen Zille to win in Johannesburg, what needs to happen is the DA must have its 2016 local government election result again. And the ANC must have its 2021 election result again. And if that happens, then the DA can win the city of Johannesburg outright. And the way that would go, just to recap the numbers, the DA in 2016 gets almost 500,000 votes in Johannesburg. It needs to get those same voters or similar voters out again for it. It needs to get 500,000 votes. The ANC in 2021 got just 300,000 votes. It and MK together must get that 300,000 again, because MK will do very well. So let's say the ANC will get 200,000 and MK will get 100. That's the 300,000 back again. The EFF will get 100,000. That goes to 400,000. And the ANC's partners in government will get about 50,000. And what happens then in the next local government election result is the DA has got 500,000. The DA bloc, the Freedom Front and the ACDP will be part of that bloc, but they're only going to get 20,000 votes, so they don't matter that much. They matter a bit. And the ANC bloc's going to get 450,000 votes. So if that happens, the ANC has its 2021 result again, and the DA has its 2016 result, then Zille can win the city outright, and then it can be governed by the DA. Short of that, I don't know what the DA would do, but our advice would be not to go into a coalition to run the city with the smaller partners, the non-ANC partners. And the reason for that is that even if that delivers a Zille mayorship, that mayorship doesn't give her the kind of executive administrative authority that she would need to run the city. She'd have a lot of political power over her little cabinet in the city, but any policy change, any reform, any small step towards fixing things requires in one form or another a resolution of the council. She doesn't have executive admin powers. And when you're in a coalition with these very small partners and every single issue needs to go through a council resolution, it's just too tempting for the smaller partners to become difficult, block things, try and trade their votes for some or other concession, and no real progress can be made. And when in preparing for this recording earlier this morning, called a few people who'd been through this before. The excellent example that was made to me was a property transaction in one of the cities a little while ago, where the city wanted to take a piece of land and zone it for a business, and this would have been absolutely great it would have been the right thing to do, but a small thing. In council, that was blocked because every populist actor started jumping up and down and said they're giving away our land to profiteer, and so in the end it went nowhere, and the investment never happened as a consequence. So the prospects for the DA, and in my opinion, of forming a coalition in Johannesburg with non-ANC partners to run the city is a no-go. They'll be sabotaged from the very start. Zille's reputation and that of the DA to govern will be muddied as a consequence, and it's best to stay clear of it. The only way is to win the election on the numbers, which means the DA gets its 2016 result, the ANC gets its 2021 result. There's one possible exception to, in my opinion, exception to this, and that is for the DA to do a deal with the ANC in the city. But it might be very difficult for it to do a deal with the current ANC in the city, because that ANC is part of the broader Gauteng ANC, which is a bit of a rebel province, and didn't go along last year with the Government of National Unity decision that was taken by the National ANC. And instead, the Gauteng ANC went along with the EFF and the like. So at this time, unless the National ANC takes hold of the Gauteng ANC and turns it to a point where it's willing to do the broader national coalition deal, the prospect of the DA doing a coalition with Gauteng ANC is limited. Let me stop there for now. This is part one, what the result could be, and then you might want to ask me a question or not. And then I'm going to go to part two, which is, regardless of whether the DA wins outright, what the implication of this is going to be in the longer term.
Sure. Let's first go to James, though.
Sure. I was just wondering, I mean, 2016 was before the Party Finance Act, Political Party Funding Act, which has put on major restrictions on the DA's funding, even if not on any of the liberation movement parties, which we discussed previously. And just another observation is one of the problems is you have to get into the bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy allocates the tenders, and the tenders are the way that these criminal networks and political networks fund themselves. But as soon as you try and touch those or try and clean that up, there's obviously a huge pushback. And I think that's what happened previously in Tshwane as well. So it's and that's the problem with the smaller parties, I think, is that there's such huge vested interests, that get affected when any reforming government comes in. And they then try and get the smaller parties to switch sides when those are being threatened, and then they have often the resources with which to try and do that. So if you have any comment on that, that would be appreciated.
So let me just start with the Party Funding Act. I think it's done enormous damage to South Africa's potential to be a successful, free and open society, because politics and contesting politics takes a lot of money. We worked it out once. I can't remember what it was, but I think it's about 30 million rand to get a percentage point in parliament, or 40 or 50 million rand on average, if you look at what parties spend. And that's because you need to put an enormous amount of marketing and communications behind yourself. And I've got little doubt that the Party Funding Act was conceived in order to sabotage the prospects that as the ANC weakened, which was inevitable, I mean, we'd called that for a very long period of time, to make sure that as the ANC weakens, that it won't be possible to fund alternatives to the ANC to the point at which they could very easily contest for political power. This was the purpose behind the thing, and it remains its purpose. Also, in the case of if you're a legitimate, decent political party, you do what's lawful, you will be constrained by the provisions of the Act. You can't take more money or money from people that you might where that sails close to the wind in terms of what the law allows. But if you are already a party that behaves in a corrupt manner, the Party Funding Act is really of little relevance to you. If you fund your campaigns in cash that appears from sort of dodgy places and the like, then the fact that there's a Party Funding Act that says you've got to declare your donors above X amount and publish their names, or their names will be published in the press, it really doesn't apply to you. So point one is this act has really, as much as probably anything, blunted the ability of South Africa's democracy to function as it should in providing voters with good, strong alternatives to the governance they've had for the last couple of years, and it lends itself to the emergence of parties like MK, which don't feel any great need to stick to things the way they might be prescribed in law. The second point is the bureaucracy of the cities and trying to break into that. Now, in Johannesburg's particular and somewhat unique circumstances, a lot of key city functions are run by these sort of companies. So the water and the electricity is run by City Power and water by something else, and there's a Johannesburg property company that owns all the properties. You can only imagine what goes on. And if you want to run the city effectively, you've got to be able to appoint the boards of these companies without obstruction, so that you can appoint the senior staff, the executive directors and the like, and provide them with the support and cover they need where they go after corruption and whatever else they can uncover. And it's again for that reason why, if you wish to run the city as a mayor or as a political party, you need executive administrative authority. Because once you start the process of breaking down the corrupt networks, not only do you place yourself in great physical danger, you could be assassinated, but the smaller parties, it's just too easy and tempting to lean on them in a manner that they obstruct your efforts at cleaning up, making the correct appointments, spending the budget where it needs to be spent, and as a consequence of cleaning up, spending the budget properly and appointing quality people, running the city successfully. So very, very much again. Helen and the DA have been given a hard time in Johannesburg for what's seen as their unwillingness to accept terms and conditions to enter into coalitions in the city. And I think one of the reasons for that is that the people who give them a hard time do not understand that in order to be successful, you do need a great degree of executive authority over what's going to happen in the city. And not just for political and ideological reasons, but because one of your first tasks is going to be undoing networks of corruption that split hundreds of millions, billions of rands between them. And obviously the opposition you would face in trying to do that will be quite considerable.
Yeah, I think that covers Helen, and although actually one more point on that, Frans, you haven't gotten to part two, which is, let's say that whatever happens, if it's successful, unsuccessful, we now know what the DA need in order to be successful in Johannesburg. But what does Helen running for mayor mean for just the rest of the country and for the prospects in 2029?
We've been saying it's the most consequential political move of the last, let's just do it, 30 years. And the reason is this, that if Zille wins the city of Johannesburg with the executive authority, administrative authority to set it right, there's a lot of reason to be confident that she will be successful in that. One of the reasons is that it is at the moment so horribly badly run that just by not running it horribly badly, and I'm confident she'd do much better than that, of course, just by not running it horribly badly, you would see bring about a marked improvement in the circumstances of people. There's a firm that I'm advising, just to give you a sense of the upsides, which is very interested in knowing whether she will win or not, because they feel that they do property, that in the event that the administration does change and become effective, and that the quality of service delivery in the city improves, there's a vast upside to Johannesburg's property market, and that they would obviously want to be early movers on. So Zille winning certainly brings about enormous improvement in circumstances in the city. If you're not familiar with Johannesburg, there are days where people don't have water, electricity is cut off for a period of time, and not because the national grid is failing, it's because the local infrastructure is breaking down. There are craters in the roads so big that you really have to be quite alert when you drive, because it's not like going through a small pothole. You could actually fall into these things and need a crane to recover your vehicle after you've left. After you've climbed out of the hole again, your car would still be in the hole. So the upsides would be enormous. And property prices, which in real terms in Johannesburg haven't been great, would lift quite quickly again. So if she wins, it's quite likely that circumstances in the city begin to improve. And if that happens, then I think the prospects are quite good that a significant chunk of the aspirant middle-class vote on the urban fringe, that's been an ANC vote historically, breaks for the DA in the next elections, which would be national elections in 2029. And particularly because it is Helen Zille. Her reputation created in much of the media has been one has been created around a series of campaigns of manufactured outrage to position her as a completely sort of unacceptable figure. And in polite society in South Africa, it's been quite the thing to do to say at a dinner party how strongly you disapprove of Mrs. Zille. Even if you've recently moved from Johannesburg to the Cape to take advantage of the culture of governance she instilled in that province and that city. But that, and she's always been quite tough on this stuff. She says, I give as good as I get, and she's fought back and the like. And people who comment on these things have always told her that's a big mistake. She'd rather just apologize for her track record in the country and go away. But now what's starting to happen is that very same personality is becoming an asset, because the hierarchy of needs of the people in the city have shifted to where having water all the time is actually a priority. And in that case, you begin to care less about what you've read in the mainstream media about her, or what's gone on Twitter and the like. And even beyond that, you start to say, well, maybe we need someone who is as hard, as determined, fights as much as this. This is perhaps what the city needs to come right. So what has been read by so many people for so long as her great liability to the DA and politics, lo and behold, in the case of Johannesburg, it turns into an asset. And as Wandering Albatross has told us, the Zille women all tend to live to be about 100. Which more than that. So she has, 3 decades left to clean the place up and sort it out, which I don't think is a thought that has cheered the ANC leadership, considering what might be in store for them here. So I think it's immensely important. And in that regard, it is the top political job in the country now, because it is the election 2016 in Johannesburg that's probably the most important directional indicator for the country. And if it turns out that she wins, and if it turns out that she's successful in getting the city right, I think it breaks a big chunk of the ANC vote for the DA in 2029, which gives South Africa renewed opportunities at building new coalitions with two partners that might be very much closer to being equals than is otherwise the case. Now, let's say she doesn't win. Let's say she gets to 40% only. Some of the smaller parties have picked up the difference, and the DA decides, and it would be entirely justified to decide this, that it's just not worth going into coalition with people whose purpose is to sabotage you. What that would mean in practice is that the ANC and MK, which will do very well in the EFF and whoever else, would likely form a government and run the city. And the sense of disappointment would be very great in the city, and the circumstances wouldn't improve. And you know what that does? Go to 2029. It again makes it clear in the minds of voters that there are hard choices to make. So I think not only is it consequential, but I think the DA has positioned itself very cleverly here, vis the ANC, that if it wins, it does well, and if it loses, it's again tees itself up very nicely ahead of the 2029 election. Gabriel.
Thank you, Franz. Richard, did you have anything you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I just had a question. Whenever I tell people here that I'm from Johannesburg, the first thing they always say is the one thing they know about Johannesburg is crime. And what power would she have over policing compared to sort of national policing?
Well, in the Western Cape,
how seriously could she act on that?
Well, in the Western Cape, that the DA governs, and in Cape Town, they are currently engaged in an increasingly aggressive strategy to have policing powers devolved to provincial and city authorities, and not just to manage the traffic and things, but to investigate serious crimes, engage in the sort of crime intelligence work that's necessary to crack syndicates. Now, the merit of the DA's approach there is that by devolving policing powers into the province and into the city, you short-circuit the need to clean up the management of the national police, which will be very difficult to do for some of the reasons James has set out for us earlier. And if the devolution into the Western Cape occurs, it can then occur into other cities as well. Short of that, and I think Zille is strong on this, she was interviewed this week by Gabriel, our Gabriel, sitting here. Yeah. And you should watch that. It's very good.
I did. Yeah.
And she was very strong on there and on some other platforms where she spoke to say, look, the DA can, one, govern the city where it has enough votes to do that. Can't do it with too few votes, or democracy. And secondly, that the DA in running a city can do what cities are allowed to do, and what city governments are supposed to do, which at this time is proper roads, much of the roads, traffic lights, electricity, the supply of water, enforcement of basic bylaws and the like. And that, yes, of course, if it were granted greater powers, it could employ those powers to bring about improvements in other areas. And one of those would certainly be crime. And just on the question of crime, there's some really good kind of security people around who it's quite a heartening thing, who think that cleaning up crime in Johannesburg isn't difficult at all. They argue that there are about 100 individuals who are responsible for the great bulk of all serious and violent crime in the city. The kind of home invasion robberies, hijackings, cash in transit heists, and they maintain that the addresses of this 100 are known. You could go to their homes and arrest them, and therefore, if the city got clean and efficient policing powers and resources, it would be a matter of days, literally days. It's astonishing to think. And one would see a vast drop in certain kinds of serious and violent crime, the social fabric crimes, the sort of alcohol-driven stuff and the like, that would obviously require more than just policing would help, obviously, but would require more than that. So the ability to turn things around quickly in the event where one does win elections and has the correct powers devolved are actually very great. I think people would be very surprised in the event that let's say you devolve policing powers and win an election in Johannesburg, how very, very quickly the prospects and environment in that city improves. Gabriel.
Yeah, I think this week has been a remarkable week for South African news, and it kind of shows the position that South Africa is in, that we are in fact in a political transition, and political transitions are difficult, they're scary, and they're unpredictable. And we have, and in the Mkhwanazi case, in the case of Helen Zille in Johannesburg, that there's these forks in the road, and the path that we choose, on multiple of these forks, will define South Africa's ultimate kind of political destiny. And it's just an incredibly exciting, I think, time to be in South African, or if not, a little bit unnerving. But I think that we should turn our attention away from South Africa to a country with much less exciting news. But we have finally, Simon, I think, might have something positive to say, because we're going to be talking about Trump's state visit to the United Kingdom. So, Simon, can you give us some context, some background, and maybe some notes on the US, UK kind of diplomacy, where it's been at, and then take us through Trump's state visit?
Sure. I think that, reasonable people, even before last week's state visit, concluded that it would be a success, because you don't organize to that extent to fail. And that was very, very much, the expectation. But I think it surpassed that. The United Kingdom and the United States have what you call, and what is known as, the special relationship. Two English-speaking countries with very strong bonds formed in war, trade, and this has endured. I think what I'll do is take you through the itinerary, as it were, and then I'll emphasize certain parts of it, some of which are relevant to South Africa, particularly on the diplomatic side, and to a lesser extent, trade. But even before last week started, we had this really quite astonishing spectacle of several C-17 Globemasters, which are the big military jets, arriving at airports in and around London, and they were offloading Marine One helicopter, and they were offloading limousines and other Chevy Suburbans attached to the Secret Service detail. And that laid the way for Trump to arrive on Air Force One at Stansted Airport on Tuesday evening, at which point he was choppered off to Winfield House in Regent's Park, which is the residence of the US ambassador to the United Kingdom, to the Court of St. James. And just a word on that guy quickly. His name is Warren Stevens, and he's a billionaire from a Arkansas banking dynasty. I've actually just opened a letter from him today, and he is one of the most impressive guys that you could ever wish to be occupying a diplomatic role. He and the Japanese ambassador to the United Kingdom really have the game completely wrapped up, and they express as often as they can how delighted they are to be here, which endears them to their local audience. And it's a masterclass in soft diplomacy. So on Tuesday night, Trump is at Winfield House, and Winfield House, by the way, is probably one of the most impressive residences you'll ever see. It's like an English country mansion in the city, and it was donated by the Woolworths for use in perpetuity. Trump spends the night there, and then the following morning he gets chopped off to Windsor Castle, which is where the ceremony really begins. And he meets up with royals, and he meets up with King Charles, and they inspect a guard of honor and their various military beat routines that they witness. And then he's shown around Windsor Castle, which has 1,000 rooms. And one of those rooms is dedicated to the collection of artifacts symbolizing the United States relationship with the United Kingdom. And apparently it's a very moving experience because you see a lot of war memorabilia. And that leads the way to the big feature of Trump's state visit, which is the state banquet. And that takes place on Wednesday night. And there you see, for the first time, kind of the secondary aspect of this state visit, because what happens at these occasions is that the visiting dignitary is afforded a guest list. And whereas in the past you've had actors and sports people for the likes of Barack Obama, for example, here you see American industry CEOs, names like Jensen Huang, who's the CEO of NVIDIA. You've got Moynihan, who's the CEO of Bank of America. You've got Karp, who's the CEO of Palantir. And you've even got some former Trump haters like Mark Benioff from Salesforce, who've been curiously rehabilitated. And they're all there, and they speak. The king speaks very warmly of the United States, and Trump in return speaks very warmly of the United Kingdom. And they drink, it's a fantastic affair. Some of the sparkling wine that they drink is actually grown on the premises of Windsor Castle. Prince Philip, genius that he was, planted the vines in relation to the sunlight. They drink Ridge Vineyards, Montebello 2000 is very, very good red wine produced in Napa Valley. And it's a very, very happy affair. And then Trump goes off to his room at 1 o'clock in the morning and starts tweeting about Jimmy Kimmel. He's unbelievable. But then the next day is just as important. Because I've already referenced the guest list from the banquet, and in the morning there are a few more. On Thursday morning, there are a few more military exercises, including a parachute display, and then Trump leaves for Chequers, which is the grace and favor residence of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, and that's also in the country. And the first stop they make, whilst in that residence, is to the business leaders from the night before. And there, the business leaders go, "This is what we're prepared to invest." And the total of that investment is $250 billion, putting all the parts and the companies together. And then they attend a joint press conference where Trump and I think previously I've alluded to, he went easy on Starmer, despite the fact that there is a little bit of tension relating to the freedom of speech and what is being imposed and plans to be imposed upon American companies in the UK. But it's a very nice affair, and I watched this press conference, and whether people like it or not, Trump is relatable. And people identify with him. And you saw in his expression whilst he was talking to the media that he was having the time of his life. And when someone is that happy, instinctively, it prompts a response in us. And, I was thinking about the story. I think my wife told me, my wife worked for the Trump organization, and this was back in November 2008. And Trump was in trouble. At the end of the financial crisis, Deutsche Bank was making noises, threatening to call in its loan. And that happened on a Friday. And on the Sunday, Trump is in New York with his daughter, I think it was Ivanka, and he says, I need to get out of Trump Tower. So they go for a walk around the block, and it's miserable. It's very cold in November in New York, and they walk together and they pass a beggar who's got his back to the wall, and there's a hat that he's accepting money in, and there's a $1 bill in the hat. And Trump says to his daughter, "That guy's got $1 more than I do." And I think that speaks to my point about him being relatable. You look at Trump, and people who hate Trump actually are looking at their own imperfections and the times they should have kept their mouths shut and chose to speak instead. But they also see his aspiration, and you can see these in much more detail than you can in someone like Mark Carney. You see him up there. Why don't you just talk about the climate for the next 3 hours? But the whole kind of point back to the deals is that we then look at these and we see that these aren't ordinary deals. These are quite specific, and they are military tech defense deals. Now, why has this happening? You can answer the same question as to why there's such a diminished opposition to Trump in London this time, as opposed to in 2019. There was a very disorganized little march, miles away from Windsor where he was, that took place in London on the Wednesday. And why do the Labour frontbenchers, who've been very clear about projecting their values as better than everyone else's, why have they been quiet now? Well, you look into those deals, and I'm afraid if you're honest, you have to answer and say, because there is a possibility that great violence lies in the future of the continent. And during the press conference, Trump declared that he tried to talk to Putin, it's not working. And after the United Nations summit of Tuesday, or his address on Tuesday, he has all but given his full backing to Zelensky. And that has tremendous implications for the European continent and for the United Kingdom, but we don't take that seriously. We hear things like Emmanuel Macron saying all French hospitals have to be on a war footing by March 2026. We hear Germany's Merz announcing that boomers have had it way too easy for too long, and that money is now going into defense. And I think now, at this point, I would say on the subject of diplomacy, and to maybe extend France's points of last week, with the prospect of great tragedy comes the prospect of opportunity in this case. And that's where South Africa enters the picture. To all France's points of last week, what we are going to see, if this turns out to be true, is a great reordering and a realignment, where the whole world has opportunities and roles to play, and that the vibrations of this fate of violence facing the continent travel across Africa. And if you want to know how to play diplomacy correctly, if you want to see how guys do it well, that visit went off without a hitch. Everyone was thrilled, even the guys in the UK. They said this was great. The relationship is actually very strong. Palantir has signed a deal with the Ministry of Defence for £1.5 billion, and that is ostensibly the first of many. How do you play diplomacy correctly? It is not that hard. You get people with the character and the wherewithal of Warren Stevens, and you let them lay out the foundations, and you let them harvest. And I don't think that the previous guy was a guy called Woody Johnson, who Rich might know as being the proprietor of the New York Jets and the heir to the Johnson & Johnson empire. He didn't do a very good job. Where this relationship needs to be in the context of what could potentially happen is it sits there exactly. And Europe has from being worried about Trump being an isolationist, it can actually move forward with more confidence than ever that if the worst comes to the worst, that there will be a united response, both in support and hopefully a reordering that see South Africa benefit, as to France's point last week. So to conclude, I think it was a masterclass in diplomacy. There were two floors at the United States Embassy in Nine Elms that had been dedicated since the invitation was offered by the King, or all those months ago, that have been working around the clock to make it happen. And it was an expression of the monarchy's soft power, which is a very compelling force, especially to a guy like Trump. But also, I can't underestimate the skill that the ambassador showed in putting everything together and making it the event that it was. Back to you, Gabriel.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. I mean, I think it's a real testament to what is achievable if you have a coherent plan and the people necessary to implement it. And I think it's, it seems as though this is one of the first pieces of good news, of real good news, to come out of the Starmer administration. So hats off to you for being able to give the devil his due, Simon. But we're gonna stay on the topic of the kind of United States. And we're gonna move to you, Richard, who you're going to tell us. We've got a few topics that we want to get to. Hopefully we can get to all of them, but we'll start with the thing that has upset my mother more than anything in the news in the last few weeks, and that is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the Make America Healthy Again debate. So can you, Richard, just outline kind of the changes, some of the proposed changes to health policy, and how you see this whole thing?
I muted myself, sorry. It's not just your mother, Gabriel. It's a lot of people. Look, R.F.K. Jr., the scion of the Kennedy family, was one of the most controversial of Trump's cabinet picks, and he squeaked by. Came very close in his confirmation hearing because people were very worried about his views on all sorts of things. And I'll get to, let's first deal with his overall job really was to restore confidence in healthcare policy in the United States. And he had a big job to do after COVID, because not just because of the advice that people were given, and this is not just in the United States, on vaccines, where they were told that vaccines were going to cure you, that were going to stop the spread. That didn't do that. That you wouldn't get COVID. That didn't work. So there was a lot of loss of faith in the vaccines. But broader than that, the public health community lost a lot of respect for very good reasons here. I'll give you two little examples. The restaurant owner in Los Angeles, who trying to keep her business alive, sets up an outdoor dining area in Los Angeles so that she can at least still selling food and people won't be closed indoors and potentially spreading the virus. She gets shut down by the LA health authorities because they just didn't want her to do that. But across the road, there is a big Hollywood production going on where people are milling around doing exactly the same thing. They have the food trucks there, and they're all sitting around eating at their tables, doing exactly what they would be on her side of the street, but because the government sees that as a potentially important economic activity, they let those people do it, but they don't let other people do it. We were told during COVID that you couldn't gather together in churches, but you could gather together in casinos. We were told that you couldn't gather in large groups to protest unless it was after George Floyd in Black Lives Matter, because racism is a significant causes significant health impacts. Therefore, there are public health benefits to gathering a large crowds together to shout and scream, because magically the virus doesn't spread when you have good intentions to protest against racism. So the public health community beclowned themselves, and they needed to restore trust. So R.F.K. Jr. comes in, and in some ways he is doing that. So he started MAHA. It's a riff on MAGA, Make America Healthy Again. And some of the advice is perfectly sensible. It's like exercise, limit your calorie intake, be sensible, drink more water, drink less alcohol. And one of the anybody who's been to the United States will notice that this is a large country. People are overweight. There is an obesity problem. And a lot of that stems not just because food is cheap and plentiful, which is a good thing. We like cheap food. We want plentiful calories. But because of government advice, the dietary guidelines for Americans came out in the early 1980s. And it did exactly the wrong thing. It told people, eat as many carbs as you like. Don't eat too much meat. Limit your fat intake. Limit your egg intake. And so limit your proteins and maximize your carbs. This is... we've now see this is very wrong advice. I mean, we were told this in the 1980s, and it spread, many other places. But this is a leading problem in obesity and all the related health problems that arise from that. So, as far as R.F.K. Jr. is going in trying to readdress that, I don't think that he should edit or reform it. I think he should just delete it. Why do we need the government to tell us what to eat? We can take advice from, I would rather, your personal trainers or gym or your family, or listen to your grandmother who might have told you to just eat sensibly, eat a balanced diet and exercise. I mean, these things are not too complicated. And yet, it takes the government to get in the way to make us all unhealthy. He goes on some things, like the red dye has been a big issue of his. He wants to remove this colorant from foods like Fruit Loops, and makes the point that in other countries, like in Europe, these additives, these dyes are not allowed. I'm skeptical, actually. I'm not sure that the science is out there that red dye is particularly bad for you. Probably if you eat only Fruit Loops and consume vast amounts of red dye, that's probably not very good for you. But the carbs in the red dye, the Fruit Loops themselves are probably more the problem than the red dye in them. So he starts veering into this stuff where I think there's not much of a sound scientific basis for that. He's employed somebody called Callie Means, who's like I think she was a doctor, but has become a sort of health influencer. And she's kind of new agey and seems to think that I think at one point she was quoted as saying that, I stand to be corrected, that the food industry is trying to kill us because of the way that, the seed oils and the additives and the junk food. And I just think that's crazy. The food industry is trying to feed us. The food industry is trying to make money. I don't think that you make money by killing your consumers. And so at the basic level, what he's doing is fine. But when you start looking at the details, it starts to get kind of worrying. Part of the problem is that of the incentives that have been created by government policy for many years, not just the dietary guidelines, but for instance, everybody complains about the high levels of high fructose corn syrup in our food. And well, it's basically, we have less sugar from sugarcane and more high fructose corn syrup, which sounds more sort of chemically and but more processed. But it's essentially just sugar. I mean, these are fructose. But the problem is that why do we have so much? Because we limit sugar imports. We protect our sugar industry, which is largely in Florida, for political reasons. And so sugar cane is more expensive to protect those farmers, and we subsidize corn. So you're subsidizing something, and so you're going to get more of it. You tax something, you're going to get less of it. So we have so much high fructose corn syrup because for decades we've been subsidizing corn. It's everywhere. We require people to have low-fat diets. Well, it doesn't taste that nice, so they add all sorts of other stuff to make it taste nicer. So let me just say that I think he's on one level he's right, but he's not attacking the right problem. Let's have less government, less subsidies, and we'll probably have better outcomes.
And Richard, can I just ask you something specific, because you haven't touched?
Yes, I'm about to get to Tylenol. Okay, and I don't want to take up too much time, but the Tylenol thing is really important, because this is another example of where I think he is showing himself to be the kook that he is. R.F.K. Jr. is a lawyer. He's a trial lawyer. He's made his business suing companies for chemicals and taking them to law courts. There's a lot written about this, and the modus operandi, and we're seeing this with Tylenol, because Tylenol is acetaminophen, it's paracetamol, Panadol, and it's there are ongoing lawsuits in various districts against the manufacture of this, taken by these trial lawyers who, this is a huge industry where they make millions of dollars suing companies. They come up with a study that finds an association between whatever chemical it is and some health outcome. They find a favorable judge. They get some experts together who will talk about this association. And very often, the companies would just rather settle, because it's these trials can go on forever and ever. They would rather just settle the case and make it go away, and the trial lawyers walk off with millions of dollars, and their plaintiffs typically get very little. So the Tylenol is a good example of this. So he comes out. I understand that before he came out, this is just a few days ago, telling pregnant women, making the association between Tylenol and autism. So if you take Tylenol, his cases, as a pregnant woman, it increases the chances that your child will develop autism later in life. There are some studies out there that find an association. But as we know, association is not causality. Correlation is not causality. And
Richard, just on that
Yes.
point, I do think that all of our mothers were on Tylenol, though.
Exactly. So, I mean, and so for pregnant women, if you get a fever, Tylenol is the only recommended pain reliever and fever reducer out there. So what they're saying is, if you have a fever, then just suck it up. The problem is that if you are fevers in pregnancy, high fevers in pregnancy can be very dangerous. You can get miscarriages, and so it's not as though there aren't risks to telling pregnant women to stop taking acetaminophen. I think this is based on junk science, and this seems to be a move designed to aid his friends in the trial lawyers who are pursuing cases actively and are now delighted that they've had the head of the HHS making these claims. I think it's extremely dangerous. It's we're delving into conspiracy theory world, and I don't like it. Let me say, this is dangerous. And it comes along with a lot of other actions that he's taking that are deeply worrying. We have a man called Vinny Prasad, who's the head of biologics at the Food and Drug Administration, and he's an acolyte of Bernie Sanders, the socialist senator who is pushing for single-payer healthcare, socialized healthcare. And Vinny is coming out. One of the things he's taken it upon himself to do is just to try and limit advertising of medicines. And you see this a lot on television here, and often depending on which channel you're watching, whatever the demographics are, you'll see certain medicines advertised, and then you tell them to talk to your doctor about getting whatever it is. He doesn't want this because he thinks it's, well, for whatever reason, he just doesn't like the idea of advertising health. I think principally because he doesn't like the idea of profit in healthcare. This is dangerous. Companies have First Amendment rights. They can, and they should be able to talk about their medicines on the public airways. But more worryingly, he's taking it upon himself to block a new immunotherapy drug for treating advanced melanomas over the objections of cancer doctors and many patients who rely on this drug. But because he's decided that the trials weren't done sufficiently well, even though these drugs have been taken well and oncologists are using them effectively. When it comes to drug pricing, they're pushing now a most favored nation drug pricing. Now, new medicines in the United States are more expensive than elsewhere. we have a freer market in drug pricing here. It's not completely, it should be freer in my opinion. But unlike most other countries, the government doesn't regulate the price of drugs. But this is the direction they're going in, and the Trump administration is trying to price drugs at the lowest rate of a comparable OECD country. The problem is, what this is going to do is push downward prices on new medicines. They started doing this in the Biden administration. There was the Inflation Reduction Act, which is this huge, vast act that did nothing. The biggest misnomer there ever was. It should be called the Inflation Creation Act. But anyway, it was essentially a climate change act, but they shoved all sorts of other things in there, including limits on the prices that Medicaid, the big public government-sponsored health program for retired people, limiting the prices to be paid for medicines. So but this is the creeping price controls coming in. Already we've seen, and I looked this up, 51 research programs for new medicines have been discontinued because of that. And they was looking at some research from the Pacific Research Institute that they expect by 2035, because of these price controls, we'll have 139 fewer drugs than consumers would otherwise benefit from. That's not very good, especially when you consider that 2 out of every 3 new medicines come out of the United States. This is where the research is being done. This is where it's being done because of the profit incentive. Profit is good in healthcare. I remember having a conversation with a left-leaning journalist years ago about her attitudes to for-profit healthcare, and she said she just hates the idea of pharmaceutical companies profiting from pain. And I said to her, but they're profiting from reducing pain. They're profiting from curing medicines. They make money when they produce something that benefits people. And she looked at me like she'd never thought of it that way. Like this was a revelation. And it was amazing. We want more profit because we want incentives to create new medicines and to create new cures to the ailments that we suffer from. When I said earlier that the United States has high drug prices for new medicines, this is true. But overall, if I go to the doctor and for whatever ailment I might have, the chances are I'll be treated with a generic. Most people get treated with generic drugs here, and although we have high prices for new drugs, the competition for generics is incredibly vigorous. So overall, when you actually look at how people are treated, your overall healthcare costs, they are comparable to other countries. So we want more competition and more incentives, and I think we're going in the opposite direction. And it's worrying. What else? How else can I rant about this man, other than his annoying voice?
No, I think we should move away from R.F.K. I think my mother is beaming watching this. But France, you've got a point, but you're going to have to unmute yourself for that.
Yeah, no, that makes a difference. I want to just you took issue with this woman who said the food companies are trying to kill Americans. But the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration testified before Congress in December that American food companies, particularly when it comes to ultra-processed foods, are deliberately trying to make them addictive, and that they are exploiting the same, here's the quote, the same neural circuits that are involved in opioid addiction. And there's growing evidence that these foods are deliberately designed to be addictive, and then they bring about these pandemics of obesity and diabetes. So isn't there something to say that American food companies have crossed an important line that requires government intervention and regulation?
Look, I mean, I live here. People are free to buy whatever they like and eat whatever they like. It is. So why I said at the beginning, if R.F.K. Jr. wants to promote people to eat healthier, not to limit their food intake and listen to the advice they might have got from their grandmothers about just limit your calories and have a varied diet. That's fine. But I think we are verging into the conspiracy. I'm not sure. Was that Marty McCarry who made that comment? I'm not sure. Okay, I don't know.
There was Caliph.
Can't be skeptical
Robert
that we have this vast conspiracy here. I think if you go to any supermarket here, you'll see a wide variety of food and people free to choose what they like. There's the idea that we're addicted is, I don't know. I don't buy it. I'm sorry, I can't hear Simon for some reason. So maybe you can translate.
Just and not to defend, not to defend RFK in any way, but Tylenol itself announced on the 7th of May 2017 that it didn't actually recommend pregnant women using its drugs, Tylenol. It actually, the company itself made that as an announcement. So, as I said, not to defend RFK from this finding, but I just found that quite an interesting.
Yeah. So Simon was basically just saying that that Tylenol had put out on in May 2017 an announcement saying that it wouldn't recommend its usage to pregnant women. So that I think the point that Simon was saying was not to kind of defend RFK, but that there is something maybe more happening here.
The ancient Greek, it was a Paracelsus, the dose makes the poison. If you are a pregnant woman and you do get a high fever, and the high fever could endanger your child, I'd imagine that the paracetamol is at that point, the benefit from that outweighs any potential future harm to your baby. We've had these strange things since RFK came out with this statement with a pregnant woman going out deliberately taking lots of Panadol or paracetamol just to stick it to the man. Well, that's also this is how deranging life has become here. But look, the dose makes the poison. Let's just take a deep breath and stop constantly finding associations and treating associations as though these are causal links. And we have the same thing bubbling up with vaccines. I thought this had been put to bed years ago, but vaccines causing autism is I think it's deeply skeptical of that one too.
I want to talk because I think that you're right, and that debate is starting to bubble up, and maybe I think we're not going to get to our last two topics, but we can cover them again next week. But I wanted to linger on a point and bring it out maybe that you were making in the beginning, Richard, when you talked about how it seems as though Robert R.F.K. and his Maha movement, there's a lot of it which is an overreaction to the excesses of COVID. That you can kind of explain a lot of the maybe insanity or the not insanity, the more extreme fringe moves taken by the Department of Health and Human Services in America by the fact that there was an incredibly deranged moment that happened just a few years ago, but a kind of reaction that swung the other way.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. But the answer is not to throw away science altogether. The answer is to stop the politicization of science that we saw. We saw these this very. I don't know. I can't look into the mind of Tony Fauci, who was leading most of these efforts, but I think he found this deeply exciting that he had this sudden power. I think this is rather like, I don't know. It's almost like I'm going to mess this up, but the sort of Lord of the Ring. It's like he found the ring, and like he was mesmerized by the power that he had over millions of people's lives. So yeah, and it led to these deranged policies that we knew were wrong. Look, let me say one thing. I'm very pleased. So Jay Bhattacharya, one of the authors of the Barrington Declaration, which was this now shown to be correct, statement by public health officials against the COVID policies. He is now the head of the NIH, and I think this is very pleasing. So it's not all bad, and Jay there is a great scientist, and we see good coming out of it. But people should be skeptical of government, definitely. We should not be skeptical of the scientific process, and science is a process, and it's a constant discovery. And let's just take a deep breath and stop latching on to whatever passing trend might be coming along.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end it. In fact, a kind of reiteration of one of the Common Sense's editorial lines that, as people seem to be cleaving into the extremes on both the left and the right, we want to try and pull people back into the center to force, rational, reasonable, and discussion and thinking to come back into politics. Just as everyone, it seems, the popular move is, pandered. Move further to your side. What we want to do here is bring people back together. So thank you so much to our esteemed panel for your contributions this week, and thank you so much to you at home for listening in, and tune in again next week for South Africa's best news podcast. I'm Gabriel Makin, and this has been Making Sense.